Fantastic. Thanks, Paul. Okay, so welcome everybody to the Evidence Library event today, looking at diversion with children and young people. It's great to see so many of you come today on this nice sunny afternoon. So this event is part of our Evidence Library event series, which gives everybody the chance to sort of ask questions of leading academics, talking about latest research in regards to criminal justice. So this afternoon, we have got Bami and Carmen from the Centre for Justice Innovation joining us today to talk about the effective point of arrest diversion for children and young people. So Bami Jolaoso is a senior innovative practice officer at CJI. She works collaboratively with practitioners and police to support and enhance innovations currently taking place within the criminal justice system, particularly within youth and adult diversion and out-of-court disposals. And we've also got Carmen Robin de Cruz, who's a senior research officer at CJI. Carmen works to research, develop and test new approaches to justice systems practice, particularly in the youth justice system. She leads the Centre's youth diversion research, including a current project exploring the responsiveness of youth diversion to children with special education needs and disabilities. So you'll see that the Centre for Justice Innovation, what we're here to talk about today, have summarised the evidence base for effective point of arrest diversion for children and young people in a review for our evidence library. And Paul will hopefully put a link to the most recent publication in the chat now. And how this afternoon is going to work is I'm going to hand over shortly to Bami and Carmen, who are going to take a few minutes to sort of share some of the overall comments about their evidence library review. And then I'll be posing some questions to them. And then I'll be handing over to Russell Webster, who's been working with clinics in producing these evidence briefings to go through a Q&A. So at that point, we really encourage questions to come through. Please post them throughout the discussion that we're having this afternoon. And then kind of Russell will open the floor to everybody to be able to ask those questions. So without further ado, Bami and Carmen, over to you.
Hi, thanks, Emma. So thank you to clinics as well for inviting us to discuss point of arrest youth diversion, or as I'll refer to it today, just youth diversion. So as Emma said, Carmen and I work for the Centre for Justice Innovation in the research and practice teams, respectively, to highlight evidence-based and practitioner-led best practice within the sector. And we've been working on youth diversion for nearly 10 years. And just to say as well, when I'm referring to youth diversion, I'm referring to the YJB definition, which is where children with a linked offence receive an alternative outcome that does not result in a criminal record, avoids escalation into the formal youth justice system and associated stigmatisation. And this may involve youth justice delivering support, intervention that may or may not be voluntary, and or signposting children and parents and carers into relevant services. I just thought I would say all of that just because as I'll talk today, I just want to make it very clear that obviously diversion is a very distinct offer, very different from prevention or statutory out-of-court disposals. And so I just wanted to make that clear distinction before I continue. And actually, we welcomed this definition from the YJB when it came a couple of years ago, because when we first started, it was really hard to define diversion, as it was used to refer to a number of programs and schemes. And also at the time, practice was quite inconsistent. Awareness of diversion was often limited. So this is with practitioners, police, multiple different agencies just had a limited awareness of what diversion was or how they could offer it to a child. And also as a result of this, the number of children recorded as first-time entrants into the youth justice system was significantly higher. And therefore practice and policy did not reflect the evidence base, because the evidence base shows that children grow out of crime. Most children will engage in risky or illegal behaviour at some point. And as you probably are all aware of the age crime curve, it shows that offending behaviour, and this is both detected and self-reported, it peaks in mid-teens and then it drops steeply at the onset of young adulthood, and then it declines more slowly. So this just demonstrates that the vast majority of children will grow out of crime, and a first offence is not a particularly strong or reliable signal that a child is going to embark in a persistent or prolific criminal career. And also the evidence shows that formal justice system processing for children involved in low-level and first-time offending can actually make them more likely to commit an offence again. And it extends and deepens their criminal careers, with outcomes much worse the further the child progresses into the system. And an international meta-analysis shows that prosecution of children appears to not only have not have a crime control effect, but across all measures appears to increase offending. And this was not just seen in one or two studies, but this was an international research consensus. And a growing body of evidence suggests that diverting children from formal criminal justice processes is a protective factor against serious and prolonged offending. So not only does the evidence show that formal justice processing can have a backfire effect and cause more offending, but diversion has also been found to be a protective factor against offending. So with that being said, we're seeing how the evidence is causing incremental change within the sector, and we're really happy to see this because it's been a long time coming, but we're seeing a lot of positive moves, such as the YJB definition that I mentioned earlier, but also the YJB and NPCC, so National Police Chiefs Council, have both moved towards child first principles, and with NPCC, child-centered policing, which both at its core promote the use of diversion. We're also seeing the youth gravity matrix is being updated to the child gravity matrix, being rebranded as a child gravity matrix, which requires eligibility criteria for diversion to follow the evidence base and good practice, which points towards empowering police to use professional discretion on a case-by-case basis, which it hadn't before. And we're also seeing more data collection from youth justice services, them being encouraged to collect local data, because we know at the moment there's no centralized data on diversion, who receives it, whether it's useful or not, and we still don't have that data. So the fact that it's being encouraged locally means that we can kind of form some sort of picture, which we really welcome. And we also know that the YJB have updated their case management guidance on diversion and will be launching their new assessment tool for diversion. So all of this is recognizing that diversion is a distinct and crucial offer for children, which we're really happy to see. But despite this, there's still some gaps in evidence, particularly on how children access and engage with diversion, because we want to ensure that children access and engage with diversion at an equal footing. So we've kind of looked at different areas that we've heard about anecdotally from practitioners that we work with. And based on this, we conducted some research on racial disparity and diversion, because we found that areas were saying locally they don't feel like children from Black and minoritized communities were receiving diversion equally or getting access to diversion, or were possibly receiving a harsher outcome in comparison to their white peers. So we conducted two pieces of research on that, one in 2021 and one in 2022. All the years seem to be blurring together, so I'm not too sure. But we have, you can read that in detail on our website, but we're also conducting research currently on special educational needs and diversion, which Carmen will probably touch on. So that was a bit of a whistle-stop tour on the evidence base and what we're looking forward to in the future, but I'll hand it over back to Emma. Hopefully that was okay.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks so much, Bami, for that introduction. And yeah, really interesting points, which I think we'll pick up on over the course of the afternoon with some of the questions. But one of my first questions from reading the evidence review is in reference to the toolkit for practitioners in valuing youth diversion that you've published, which promotes your 6 good practice principles. One of them in that is in relation to the eligibility criteria for diversion schemes and what you think about that. So be interested to hear a bit more of what you, why you believe that there should be a shift towards accepting people onto diversion schemes who accept responsibility for their offence, rather than specifically having to admit to that offence prior to participation.
Thanks, Emma. So I guess I didn't mention this before, but when we say formal justice processing, we're talking about statutory out-of-court disposal, so a youth caution or youth conditional caution, and also going to court. So diversion at its core should be diverting the child away from formal justice processing, which means a statutory out-of-court disposal or being charged to court. And so we know in the Legal Aid, Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act in 2012, it sets out that in order to receive a caution or youth caution, you need to admit guilt. But the fact that diversion isn't either of those two means that you shouldn't have the same standards as someone with a statutory out-of-court disposal. So that's the first thing we kind of say, because if a child is being diverted, they should be receiving a no further action from the police or a community resolution, which actually requires the person to accept responsibility. So a no further action doesn't require anything, it's just kind of no further action. But community resolution requires acceptance of responsibility. So neither require an admission of guilt. So we're quite surprised to see that a lot of diversion schemes are requiring children to admit guilt when this is not really set out legally. But also in the same breath, this is happening practically a lot of areas. When they de-divert children, they are given an NFA, either there's an outcome 21 or outcome 22, or given a community resolution outcome 8, because it's just two very distinct ways of working, and we just think it requires separation. And that's why often we even say the people that work with children on a diversion should be separate from the people that work with children on a statutory out of court disposal, because it's just very two different ways of working. But also, just touching on guilt, there's a lot of emerging studies around guilt and its links to maturity. Guilt has so many negative connotations, and a child might not want to admit guilt at that stage when they're told to admit guilt in order to receive a diversion. It might be that they might not accept that they might accept that responsibility, but might not want to admit guilt. But maybe later on, as they work with the Youth Justice Service, they can kind of work on understanding the impact of their actions and the consequences, and maybe how they can ensure that they do not, commit that offence again or go back to that kind of behaviour. So guilt can be something that can develop with time. So to kind of say that, you must admit it in order to receive this help, we think that's kind of, missing the point of diversion. And also, there's just no strong evidence that kind of links showing remorse, admitting guilt, to how a child will engage with diversion or engage in many different areas of the justice system. So I think we want to make sure that what we're doing is evidence-led. And I think often sometimes there's things that we've just always done. We've always done it this way, so that's why we're going to do it this way. But actually, I think if we look at the evidence, there's nothing that points towards that. And also, lastly, if we're looking at racial disparity, we know from the Lamy Review and other studies since that Black people, especially Black men and Black boys, they have lower levels of trust within the criminal justice system, and also that comes with admitting guilt or making a guilty plea at court, but in this case admitting guilt. Because they have a lower level of trust, they might be less willing to make a formal admission of guilt, and so that means that they're going to be barred from accessing diversion, which their counterparts from other races might not. And so if we take away that eligibility criteria, that means we're opening the door for more children to be diverted. So it's just something to consider. But I know that this is all happening practically, but there are just a few points around that.
No, that's great. Thank you. Because it's really interesting to just think about the initial, let's just like the removal of that barrier, as you say, particularly with the population you're speaking about, in terms of that guilt being an initial barrier, and then kind of shutting the door to any opportunities for diversion schemes. So it's a really interesting way to think about it. One of the other sort of good practice principles that you cited highlights the need for relatively light touch and informal interventions within diversion schemes, and emphasising the importance of them being proportionate to the initial offending behaviour as well. So have you got any examples of the types of interventions that you've found to be particularly successful?
This is a really interesting question. Bami and I were talking about this earlier. I think definitely something that we're calling for, especially we have called for in the toolkit, is more evaluations around specific interventions. So broadly, we know that from the evidence base, interventions should be therapeutic rather than focused on control. So the research tends to break up those kind of control-based programs into 3 categories. So interventions that are focused on discipline, so things like boot camps, interventions that are geared towards deterrence through fear, so things like scared straight programs, and then also ones that kind of are hinged on surveillance, so kind of intensive supervision of the child. And we know from research that these tend to actually have a backfire effect. They can make reoffending more likely, and they can alienate the child and kind of set them on a path towards greater entrenchment in the criminal justice system. And on the other hand, we have more therapeutic interventions. So things like restorative justice, work with victims, skill building, which in particular links up with child first principles of seeing the strengths and assets of that child and kind of developing a pro-social identity. Things like counselling, and then also multiple coordinated services. So the idea that that child may have existing professional networks outside, they might have strong links with their teachers or social care. So the idea that there should be kind of a holistic view, and the justice system doesn't need to be a single agency that takes full responsibility for perhaps addressing welfare needs that are better addressed through other avenues. But we do know that a proportionate response, one of our kind of 3 overarching principles, is not overdosing young children, and this is around being proportionate. So the intervention should be proportionate to the initial offending, and it may be that a proportionate response doesn't include an intervention. It might be that the very fact of diversion is enough. And that's probably for a very kind of low level, probably first time offending. But I think it's really important to note that sometimes maybe there isn't a need for intervention. Maybe that child is already working with another agency, and their needs and kind of risks or whatever are being met through that agency. And Bami mentioned some work that we did looking at kind of children's experiences of diversion through kind of a racial disproportionality lens. And something that we came up again and again was with really kind of the blunt use of interventions and a really kind of not a tailored approach. So, for example, some of the children we interviewed said that they had been given a knife crime awareness intervention or knife crime intervention when they had when that's kind of the use of carrying a knife was not even kind of on their radar. So really kind of a really mismatched intervention for that child, and really kind of straying from the idea of risk need responsivity, and kind of playing to that child's strengths, their assets, and their interests as well. And again, that links back to kind of child first, and the child having something to say about what interventions they should be receiving. But yeah, like I say, the kind of things that we hear about on diversions are things like maybe if kind of cannabis is involved, kind of cannabis awareness, lots of really exciting restorative justice work that we're hoping to look into more. Knife crime awareness tends to be for kind of higher level stuff, or if it's kind of linked. But yeah, work with drugs agencies, works with where Youth Justice Service has kind of specialists in-house like speech and language therapists. It might be work with those, might be with their ETE worker. So loads of different interventions, but I think we definitely at the centre would call for more evaluations of specific interventions. So the idea and the principle of diversion has been researched really quite thoroughly. So we know that this idea is kind of watertight from a research point of view, and we know kind of the general principles, like, you know, it shouldn't be, and the intervention shouldn't be geared towards control, rather they should be therapeutic. But it would be great to have kind of some evaluations of specific interventions, so we could say these interventions work well for these kinds of needs and these kinds of children. But again, we would say that doesn't need to be kind of it doesn't need to it could be kind of quite a light touch evaluation. So I know lots of youth justice services do really important work around and getting feedback from their children, the children that they work with, about how they find the interventions that they've worked on. And I think that's really important. And they do kind of I know obviously diversion is kind of light touch, short term, but often they still do the kind of progress thing with them. So they do the form, like where that child is at the start and where they are at maybe 12 weeks down the line, and that's really important in kind of assessing that intervention. So we're not necessarily asking for randomized control trials, which are expensive and not necessarily always ethical in when we're thinking about diversion, but more looking into what works. Yeah, so that's what I'd say about interventions. I hope that answers the question a bit.
No, it does, and it was a big question, Carmen. So thank you for taking that time. And I think that what I'm hearing there is very much, we know diversion works. Let's gear that research up to what specific interventions, like you say, and actually get some real sort of qualitative analysis on why that works and what the best types of interventions for young people are. I want to make sure that we take some time, and my next question is in relation to what both Bami and Carmen have already said around the problems that you've kind of highlighted in the evidence review around racial disparity and diversion. And I know that you refer to them being as a sort of a climate of mistrust that currently exists within youth justice. What would you recommend needs to happen in order to change this for future diversion schemes?
Well, I mean, obviously the bigger issues, the wider issues around racial disparity and disproportionality within the justice system, they're systemic, very, very deep rooted. And so obviously there's only so much we can do, but I think there's little things that we can kind of implement within diversion schemes that can really make a difference. And I think first, just acknowledging that we are operating within a climate of mistrust. A lot of children that come into the youth justice system or come into contact with youth justice agencies, they probably already had a negative experience with other justice agencies. They probably heard about other people's negative experiences. Or they might even have negative experience with other agencies that are in roles of authority, whether that's social care, education. They might have felt poorly treated or misunderstood. So just firstly acknowledging that and making that, I know that that's becoming part of the new assessment tool for youth justice services, to kind of acknowledge where a child has felt discriminated against or has felt any kind of barriers, kind of noting down any barriers to them engaging with diversion is important. I think just to kind of make a note of that is really important going forward. But another thing, I guess we touched on the eligibility criteria and admission of guilt. But another area is prior offences. So we know that certain communities, for example, Black communities, are more over-policed than others. And so for that reason, they're more likely to be stop and searched. And so children that might be coming into the justice system for example, possession of cannabis, it might be disproportionately Black because they might be over-policed. And if you bar a child from accessing a diversion scheme because of prior offences, you're actually saying, well, you're kind of discrediting the fact that it might be that their white counterparts are doing the same thing, or other races are doing the same thing, but they're just not being policed in the same way. So I think it's important to acknowledge that and maybe think around, why the need for barring children access to diversion because of prior offences is there, and maybe take it by a case-by-case basis. Obviously, if a child has continuously received a diversion for the same offence 7 times and then they come in the 8th time, there might be cause to say maybe they can't. But once again, it's just important to note that it should be case-by-case basis and not for specific offences or for the number of offences. Another thing is just enhancing engagement, just being a bit more flexible and open and creative around ways to ensure that a child is engaged. Because I think I even saw a comment in the chat box around a child maybe having a trauma response and not engaging. So just being aware that a child might have different, complexities around them, and that might affect how they engage. So just having an agreed, I guess, idea of what engagement looks like for each child, and this being agreed with maybe the partner agencies that you're working with, to ensure that, if the child isn't engaging, more is being done to ensure that they are engaging, and it's not just that they're not engaging and maybe we'll see this as non-compliance. And also another thing I would say is just trying as much as possible to have a cultural competence and inclusion, being aware that children come from multiple different backgrounds, different experiences, and really utilizing the community that they already live in, to ensure that whatever they do within the divergent scheme also supports them to lead pro-social lives within the community. And also there's good planning and exit strategies to ensure that even after they finish working with the Youth Justice Service, that they now have a way to work within their community or support their community. A lot of children might feel like they're kind of, there's not really much for them. We see a lot around the decrease of youth centres and activities for children in general. So kind of pointing them to the things that they can engage in, and making sure as well where possible that it's reflective of their culture and their community is really important, to give them that sense of community as well. And sometimes as well, like, we acknowledge that sometimes you might not be able to have that workplace that's very diverse, depending on the area you live as well, or depending on the staff, it might not be able to be that diverse. But that doesn't mean, I'm not trying to discredit practitioners and say if you're not diverse, you're not understanding the backgrounds of different children. But it might be useful as well to really work with people within the community who understand different cultures or understand different communities and are able to liaise with certain groups better. For example, we know one area, they had a huge population of Gypsy, Roma and traveller children, and they invited a Gypsy, Roma and traveller liaison worker to work with them really closely, because there was certain things that, you know, they could understand a bit better, or trust was built faster because of that connection and that partnership. So those are just some of the things, and this is all kind of detailed in one of our papers, which we can link as well. But just as well, like, empowering staff as well to just kind of talk about when you think that there's been certain behaviour by a certain agency, being able to challenge that and able to say, actually, we think this could have been handled better, or we noticed that there were some behaviours or some words used that weren't appropriate, and being able to challenge that effectively and having a system in place where you're able to challenge, I think it's really important to ensure that the child is being advocated for appropriately as well.
Thank you, Bami. Yeah, I think that sort of safe space to challenge and empower and to have those challenging conversations is so crucial. I'm glad that you made that reference, but thank you for those insights. I've got loads more questions, but I'm going to hand over to Russell to have some questions from the floor now, so that I don't take up all of the time in this call. So over to you, Russell.
Lovely, thanks very much, Emma. A couple of people have got their questions in already, so I'm going to go to them. If you would be kind enough just to introduce yourself briefly, but without being rude, if you could skip the bit where you talk about your organisation for kind of 3 minutes and everything it's ever achieved, because we've only got about half an hour and I'm keen to get as many people on the floor as possible. So Sue Hawley had an interesting question about kind of trauma-informed practice. Are you there, Sue? Are you able to speak?
I have to take my headphones out and put them back in again, apparently, for people to be able to hear me. So my name's Sue. I'm not going to talk for 3 minutes about where I work. I'm lucky enough to be able to get in on this because of where I work, but I've actually wanted to come because I'm the mum of a developmental child who sits on the fringes of, well, not even on the fringes, actually, he's in it, since he was about 12 and now he's 19, of the criminal justice system. So there were a couple of things in there, one of which you've answered actually, about, you know, children not engaging because of their trauma, and how creative can you be in, one, seeing that, and two, getting them to engage. But the other thing that I sort of pointed out, really more than a question, was when you were talking about guilt. And I suppose, I don't know whether I've been looking at it from the correct point, but
So we're struggling to hear you. Can you just kind of increase your volume and just ask the question, because we're missing quite a lot, I'm afraid.
Can you hear me better now? Yeah. Okay, so the point really was about the difference between guilt and shame, which came back to you when you were talking about getting people to admit guilt. And I was just kind of wondering whether or not, for children that are very entrenched in their trauma and their shame behaviours, because it's really difficult for them to move from shame to guilt, I wonder whether they confuse the admitting guilt to something with feelings of shame.
Thanks, Sue. You're fading out again. No, I think we got your kind of the gist of your question there, that people might be feeling quite a lot of shame, and that can be confused sometimes for non-admission of guilt and possibly disqualify people from diversion. So I don't know who would most like to take that question, Bami or Carmen?
I don't mind taking that one. Thank you, Sue. I think, yeah, like, there's a lot around kind of the connotations around guilt and what that might mean for a child, you know, who's still developing, you know, their brain for they've still got quite a few years to go. So their understanding of guilt, and it might literally just be linked to shame. And maybe that's why even when they're asked about whether they feel guilty about their actions, they might say no, because maybe they don't feel shame around it and they don't feel bad. And, you know, maybe guilt doesn't have to mean that you feel bad. It just might mean that you understand, you know, that what you did wasn't right. And I think that's why it's really important to kind of move away from the admitting guilt, because I think that can be worked on later. Like you said, if it's solely entrenched in shame, then working with the child to ensure that they understand that you shouldn't feel ashamed of what you've done. It's in the past. We can move forward. This is how we can move forward and ensure that you're not, you know, recreating the same behaviors or going back to, you know, behaviors that have led you to this offense, is really important. And I think if you kind of don't allow a child to access diversion because of that one thing, you might be missing out on an opportunity to really have a really teachable moment with the child and explain this. Because I think for most young people, or I remember when I was that age, if I didn't feel sorry about something, I didn't want to apologize. Not that I couldn't apologize, I just didn't want to. And, you know, that can last for a really long, I mean, people still as adults, you know, don't want to apologize for something when they know they've done something wrong. So I think it's quite a lot to kind of say, well, you're not going to access something that could actually be really beneficial to you because of this one thing, especially when we're saying, you know, a child has received a community resolution, a child should be receiving a community resolution or a no further action, which doesn't require that. So I think that's what I would say. I'm not like a specialist or anything, so I wouldn't be able to tell you on the ins and outs on that, but I think that's probably a thought of mine.
Thanks, Bami. I'm not going to go back to you, Sue, just only because we're struggling to hear from you. Paul Rainsford, you wanted to ask a question about the victim's perspective, so please do.
Hi there, good afternoon everyone. I'm Paul Rainsford, the Youth Justice Service Police Officer. I've actually want to ask a different question, which I think is more appropriate with regards to the system. So I this morning I've been to see two kids to give them youth cautions, and basically they'd been to court and they'd got no comment, so they had to be charged for the offence, which were knife offences. My question is that we seem to be seeing a lot of young children that are being advised by the solicitors to go no comment on interview, which is really limiting our decisions in terms of the amount of options we've got available for disposals and outcomes. Is there any work being taken place with solicitors and legal advisors to better special advise them in the outcomes and how their advice affects the outcomes at court? Because when I spoke to these two children today and I asked them, why did you go then?
Paul, I think you've made your question pretty clear, and I think it's probably going to be right up either Bami or Carmen Street, that one. So
thank you.
I think we could both kind of say a lot about this, couldn't we, Bami? But I think this came up again and again in our report around that kind of no comment being a big barrier to being kind of accessing some of the lower level outcomes, and also kind of it being a route to escalation. And especially when we talk to children on our interview schedules, one of the things was around no comment interviews and kind of exploring why they might have given a no comment interview. Some of that stems from kind of what they've heard. Some of the kids told us that they've seen it on TV, no comment, no comment, no comment. Some quite a few said that it was on their solicitor's advice. And I think you're right that there needs to be a bunch of education, a bunch of training, I should say, around kind of diversion schemes in particular and their requirements, especially at a local level for defence solicitors. And I think one of the issues we found, we did a bit of work around youth court, and we tried to engage defence solicitors, and we found them really hard to reach, actually. And a lot of that is due to the fact that kind of youth justice system work isn't necessarily seen as a specialism. Often it's seen as kind of a training ground. So we don't necessarily have a huge number of defence solicitors who are specialists in youth justice, and diversion is often seen as kind of a bit niche, which is strange considering it's a huge portion of youth justice services workload. But often, like Bami was alluding to earlier, in the kind of mismatch of terminology. People will talk about diversion and mean just diversion from court. So sometimes for a solicitor, just being diverted from court, getting a youth conditional caution rather than a diversion, for example, rather than going to court is kind of a big win. And so we are definitely pushing to do some work, and we've been in conversation with partners like the Just for Kids Law, Youth Justice Legal Centre for a while now, on how we can reach out to defence solicitors, to defence community, to better to raise awareness about kind of these different outcomes and what their advice can mean in terms of barring access to some of these schemes and some of these outcomes. And we know that some local youth justice services have done brilliant outreach work with their defence communities and have really good links with kind of local firms, and they kind of explain, these are the schemes we have on offer, this is how you could explain the scheme to young people. But one of our recommendations from the report that Bami highlighted earlier is around greater awareness raising amongst solicitors, so they don't give kind of a blanket no comment advice. But yeah, I completely agree that there needs to be more work around that, and more engagement between police and defence solicitors and youth justice services and defence solicitors, for sure.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Carmen.
sorry, just very quickly, and just to that, we have been saying that we do want to hold like some sort of workshop with both police and solicitors, because sometimes I feel like they work like they're not on the same team, but really there should be some sort of teamwork in there, because they're trying to do what's best for the child and for victims as well. And so talking more around about disclosure and no comment interviews and the effects of that. But like Carmen said, solicitors are a very hard to reach group, so we're still working on it, so hopefully we can have something in the future about that.
Thank you very much. It's interesting how broad a kind of subject, how many professional groups are involved in this. Plenty of questions coming in, I'm glad to say. A question from Vicky Fogel now on what the system can do generally just to kind of drive up best practice and awareness of best practice. Vicky?
Hi, thank you. Really interesting content here, thank you. I just wondered if, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but whether there are particular structural issues that spring to mind that are causing barriers to diversion working effectively or being expanded, and whether you have any thoughts on how the system itself could, needs to change to remove barriers rather than practice.
Thanks, Vicky. No, don't worry. Both Bami and Carmen have got loads to say on this, I know. So please feel free to put them on the spot, because it is their area of expertise. Who would like to go first?
I can start, but Carmen, please do jump in if I'm forgetting anything. I think our main struggle is, I think you've mentioned it, just around like data collection. It is such a shame that there's no real data being collected centrally, and it's one of the main issues. I'm not really sure why it can't be, because there's data on cautions, and it would just be useful to know what the cohort of children receiving diversion look like, and what happens after a year or 2 years once they've received a diversion. Like we just don't have that data, and we do, even though data is being collected locally and we know that some areas evaluate their diversion schemes, we just don't have a national picture. And I think that's why diversion is still it's still quite inconsistent and patchy in some areas, especially areas where they're neighboring, and they might have a really great diversion scheme in one area, and then you cross the street and the diversion area or the diversion offer is completely different. We do see that as quite a shame. And I think as well, because of that lack of national consistency, if there's a police force that maybe works with 2 different youth justice services, and one youth justice service has a really great offer, but the other youth justice service maybe hasn't got the same offer, children who live in the same area are just not getting the same offer, not getting the same support, and that's really a shame. And where we really champion local practice being local practice, and you know that your local needs and what children need in that area, we do think there needs to be some sort of standardization. And on top of that, with funding, I think it was the Youth Justice Board that did a scoping review of youth justice services. I think it was in 2021, and they found that most youth justice services mostly most of their caseload is diversion. I think one area it was 80% diversion and 20% statutory cases, which is great, but that also means that the funding formula needs to kind of mirror that, and it doesn't at the moment. So areas are kind of having to be a bit, I guess, creative with their funding to make sure that they're able to work with children who are being diverted and provide the interventions that they need when they're not being funded for that. So once again, that's quite unfair. So if an area has really great funding, maybe their PCC is funding them quite well and they're able to do that work, it's great. But if another area doesn't have that, then they're going to struggle. So there needs to be something around there where the funding formula is effectively changed. And I think the YJB has called for that as well. And yeah, I think the YJB has changed their, I think it's their youth justice plans. They have included diversion. That I think youth justice services here will probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you now have to include, like, you know, what your plan is and around diversion, which is great because that wasn't there before. So now it's kind of acknowledging that it's a lot of work and you need to actually plan for it. So I think that's one step. But I think, yeah, there's a lot of things structurally that could be changed that, you know, I think it's quite, I mean, I'm not a policymaker, but I think it seems quite easy to fix. But it just hasn't happened yet. So there's a few things I can think of. But Carmen, if you have any more.
I think there's a bit of a good news story here about the YJB having new data recording requirements around diversion. So I think in a few years' time, we're going to be in a position where we can say this is kind of the cohort of kids that are being diverted. And that's also linked up to their KPIs, including around special educational needs, including around racial disproportionality. So we'll get a better idea of the kids who are being diverted. And also, I think lots of our research is focused on kind of access to and engagement with diversion through the lens of racial disproportionality, and currently through the lens of the overrepresentation of kids with special educational needs and disabilities. So having that data will help us kind of address those kind of structural issues better, I think. Another kind of thing that I think Bami and I see again and again, especially Bami with her kind of leading on the practice work, is kind of relationships between police and the Youth Justice Service, and maybe sometimes a mismatch of maybe overriding aims, or maybe a mismatch in kind of cultures, and that specifically affects diversion, because diversion has historically been seen as a bit of a kind of light touch, sometimes kind of too soft approach, which isn't true, but it's often kind of sometimes seen as that. And where there isn't a good relationship between the police and the Youth Justice Service, and where there aren't those lines of communication open, a case that would otherwise be diverted if it was sent to kind of joint decision making between the police and Youth Justice Services, and instead dealt with unilaterally by the police and maybe kind of unnecessarily escalated. So I think there's something around strengthening kind of lines of communication, working practices between police and Youth Justice Services, because I think there's real inconsistency. I know best practice, and in the new kind of YJB out of court disposal guidance, which includes informal diversion, they call for joint decision making as kind of best practice, and including police, including Youth Justice in all Youth Justice Services and all kind of all decision making. But often, especially kind of around community resolutions, you get kind of street issued community resolutions, which won't necessarily be flagged to the Youth Justice Service. So there's kind of a mismatch in communication, and some kids not really being brought to the attention of the Youth Justice Service when perhaps staff there would like that to be the case, and maybe racking up a few CRs before they then kind of get escalated, and the Youth Justice Service not necessarily knowing about that. I'm not sure necessarily, sorry, if that's a structural issue, but that's one of my bugbears. But yeah, I think I think the data thing, although it can sometimes seem like a dry ask for more data, I think knowing the cohort of kids that are being diverted, and also knowing the cohort of kids that are missing out on that opportunity, is really important, and can shine a light on how we can make diversion more responsive. And one of our kind of overarching principles is around equality of access to diversion. So making sure that all the kids who should be eligible for diversion are actually offered it, and are supported to engage with it. And that again links back to not only racial disproportionality, but overrepresentation of children with special educational needs and disabilities, for example.
Thanks, Carmen. And while we're waiting for the the next question, I know you mentioned children with special educational needs and disabilities there, and I know you're particularly excited about a new project that you're doing. So I better let you kind of mention that now, I think.
I have been waiting for this opportunity. Yes, so we're really excited about this. And I can actually see someone who from one of our 3 sites we're working with is here. I won't give her a shout out because it's supposed to be anonymous, but thank you for coming. But yeah, so this current project we're doing is around looking at the responsiveness of youth diversion to children with special educational needs and disabilities. And it kind of rose out of conversations that Bami and colleagues had with practitioners saying that these needs are really prevalent in the youth justice system cohort. So, for example, I've got here, in the year to March 2020, 71% of sentenced children had speech, language and communication needs. So these types of needs are really prevalent. And with diversion being kind of a gateway out of the formal criminal justice system, does that suggest that it's not as responsive as it could be to kids with special educational needs? So the idea of this project is to look at the whole youth diversion process from kind of decision making, ask does that child get diversion, right through to engagement and exit strategy. Is that child supported to engage with diversion, make the most of it? Are they given a robust exit strategy so they don't have a kind of a cliff edge of support falling away? But I think it's really important to flag that diversion is probably especially important for kids with special educational needs and disabilities. So, for example, if we're talking about the interruption to education that an arrest can cause, or a court appearance, or even a custodial sentence can cause to schooling, that's particularly acute for kids who access really important support structures through their education, things like education, health and care plans, things like alternative provision services. And then if we talk about kind of job market implications, like reduced job opportunities because of criminal record, that's even more acute, even more marked for kids who might already have face barriers in accessing the job market. And I think something that's flagged again and again in the lit review, and is probably most important from this point of view, is that diversion is really important from kind of a rights point of view for these children, because there's guidance around the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child that says that kids with developmental delays or neurodevelopmental disorders or disabilities should not be in the child justice system at all. And I know that diversion has long been called for as kind of a default response for kids with special educational needs, and increasingly it's been called for as a default response to all children. So there's definitely kind of a rights angle to it, which I think is really important. But just while I'm able to plug the project, just to let you know what we're doing. So we've done a lit review, which you can find on our website, which already flagged to us some barriers. So things that we have kind of already talked about today, around kind of maybe children, especially children with communication difficulties, not necessarily understanding the behavioural expectations or consequences of a police interview and how that might lead to escalation in that outcome. Practitioners may be misinterpreting communication difficulties as kind of behavioural or attitudinal issues, and therefore escalating the outcome. And we've been doing interviews with practitioners, and one of the questions we ask about is remorse, and there's definitely different weight attached to kind of how important different practitioners find children's display of remorse in terms of what outcome they get. And I think that's a really important finding for us. But currently we're working with sites, we're doing interviews with practitioners around improving the responsiveness of youth diversion to children with special educational needs. We've also got a practitioner survey, which
Carmen, can I just squeeze in one last question, because
yeah, you can.
I know that's a big project. I know people that sign up for your newsletter will be able to kind of keep abreast of that, and I'm sure people get involved in the practitioner survey. But if people don't mind, if Vicky and Victoria don't mind, you both asked the same questions. I'm just going to say it's quite straightforward, but I'm sure there's quite a lot of people who would like to be absolutely sure of this, which is, could you just spell out the difference between diversion and OOCDs, out of court diversions?
Hi, yeah, it is a bit confusing. So when we say diversion, we are normally referring to something that sits outside of out-of-court disposals. So when a child is offered support interventions from the Youth Justice Service, and that can result in a no further action from the police, but they are receiving that support. But you can also receive a non-statutory out-of-court disposal, which is a community resolution, and that can still be considered a diversion because you are not receiving a criminal record. The difference is that out-of-court disposals, which are youth cautions and youth conditional cautions, they require an admission of guilt and will end up being a criminal record, whereas a community resolution and a diversion, they are kept on police systems, so they are detectable, but they are not necessarily disclosable. So it's dependent on the police discretion to kind of say whether or not a child has received this. But an out-of-court disposal is distinctively disclosable. It is a criminal record, and so that's the difference. We don't want a child to have a criminal record, but also an out-of-court disposal is what is recorded as a first-time entrant. So if a child has received an out-of-court disposal, whether it's a youth caution or youth conditional caution, they will be called a first-time entrant into the youth justice system, whereas a child on diversion or a community resolution would not. I hope that makes sense. But I'm happy to, if you want to speak, we can speak further about it if it's not clear.
And the distinction is sometimes between kind of formal and informal, or statutory and non-statutory, youth caution and youth conditional caution being formal, statutory, community resolution being informal, non-statutory. Is that right, Bami? And someone mentioned outcome 22. So outcome 22 is, and community resolutions are what we see most kind of diversions go through those outcomes. Sometimes outcome 21 or outcome 20, where another agency is already kind of working.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I knew that wasn't going to be as straightforward as it appears, which is obviously why people wanted to, to kind of delve into it a bit more. Wanted to thank Carmen and Bami so much for coming today, because not only did you write the review, but you've also come on. I think we've had, certainly speaking from my point of view, a really wide-ranging discussion. I see lots of people have got involved. Please do use the Centre for Justice Innovation's resources around this area, as they are the acknowledged kind of experts. And I'm going to send us back to you, Emma, and let you kind of wrap up. Thank you very much, everyone.
Brilliant. Thank you, Russell. And yeah, echoing Russell, big thank you to Bami and Carmen for their time this afternoon and for the review. It's been really interesting and kind of given a lot of people more food for thought, I'm sure. A couple of things that Bami and Carmen shared with us before. I think Paul's going to link in the chat now to the publications that they've got around diversion, and also how to sign up for updates and subscribe. So please do have a look at that and everything that's on their website. There's lots of useful information there. Yeah, just again, big thank you to everybody. Thanks to Russell for sort of chairing that Q&A, and thank you to Paul, who's been working behind the scenes to making sure that this event goes around. And most importantly, thank you to all of you for coming across this afternoon to kind of hear more from this Evidence Library event. One big ask of you before everybody disappears is to complete our feedback form for our evaluation. We're always looking to think about how we can enhance Clinks' events, in particular in relation to the Evidence Library. So Paul's going to pop a link in the chat there. It will just take you a minute or so to just give us some quick feedback. It would be much appreciated. And the video will be online soon once we've got it edited. So please do think about who you'd like to share that, if you've got any colleagues or anybody that you think would be interested in catching up on this event. And also have a look on our website for any upcoming events we'll be scheduling in a next Evidence Library event in the near future. And we've got loads of other stuff. Clinks is back from a bit of a break over the summer period. Our events program is up and running for September, so we'd love to see you all there. Otherwise, that's it from me. Thank you so much. Thanks to everybody and have a great afternoon.